right, so thank you all for coming, especially after lunch on the last day of the event. I have something that has kind of been one of my own pet projects. So my name is Kyle Ruddy, and I do have to put in the disclaimer that I do work for VMware. However, this is not something that VMware has put together. This is something that was completely on my own time. And so if you open like a support ticket, they're going to say no. Like not even just you need SDK support. They're just going to say no. So what I'm talking about here today is something that was very near and dear to my heart when I was on the customer side, because we always went through the security audits and reviews, and it was really hard to generate those reports. So this was in the era of right about when vCheck was starting. Alan Renouf was doing some really great work with vCheck, and I created a couple additions for that, some plugins for that. However, it really didn't fit the needs of our security and compliance requirements. So between living through that pain of trying to generate that roughly every 6 months, and then technology has gotten better. There's a lot more and better tools that are out there. So let's kind of dive in. What I'll be talking about here is the vSphere hardening guide, which is now the vSphere security guide. Then we're going to be taking a look at a tool that's now owned by Chef called InSpec. Then we're going to take a look at a couple of resource packs, including one that I created, and then do a bunch of demos. So security configuration guide. This is what used to be known as the hardening guide. This basically takes a look at your vSphere environment, everything from the VMs to your network to your disks, and comes up with some best practices. Whether or not that's for auditing or actually to change it. So like on the vCenter server, there's SSO vulnerabilities or changes that you can make to harden your system. Host level wise, there's stuff like secure boot and lockdown mode. Disk wise, isolating your IP, your iSCSI traffic, and following best practices for authentication. Patching for your VMs, as well as VM hardware, things of that nature. So again, this used to be the hardening guide. With vSphere 6.0, that was changed over to the configuration guide. And the concept behind that was because vSphere is getting more and more secure by default. So there are less and less things with each release that you have to change or update in order to be secure. And this security guide is out there still under the old hardening guide URL, but it's still there and still the same. So as part of the spreadsheet, there are a couple different characteristics that it'll disclose. So it'll start talking about hardening, things that are site specific, which means that VMware can't actually tell you what you should do, but kind of like this is best practice. And then auditing, so things that should change very often, or that you should check very often. And actually, before we move into InSpec, here's a download of the configuration guide itself. This is literally just an Excel spreadsheet. So it'll tell you which risk profile it is, along with an ID, give you a description of what's being covered in that line, some more tidbits about any potential vulnerabilities, and then the more interesting part is further down. So it actually gives you steps to take a look at to either remediate or audit. So here we have something through the web client. We have more web client, the vSphere API, if an API actually exists for it, ESXi or ESXCLI commands. Then since we're at a PowerShell conference, we have our PowerCLI, both assessment as well as remediation. So like down here, this is setting your NTP settings for all the hosts. So it gives you not only the line on how to audit that, which is this guy right here, then it also gives you the remediation steps as well. All right, so let's take a brief look at InSpec here. So this is something, InSpec is something that is now owned by Chef, and it's an open source language used to describe and test for regulatory concerns, recommendations, or requirements. Basically put in my own terms, it's compliance as code. It is open source. There is a GitHub repo that's out there, that you can, download it, look at the source code, make contributions back, all kinds of things, open up issues, all things like that. So there are a couple things that you need to be familiar with when discussing InSpec. So we have a test. So this is a single procedure that you run against a node or an object. Then you have a control, which is a set of those tests that is represented in a single file. I've got examples of both of these later. Then we have a profile, which is then an even further wrap up of the controls. Then we have our target. That's your node or that system that you're verifying these tests against. Then we have a job, which is the process of running it against a node. And then lastly, it's the resource pack. In the PowerShell world, you can think of a resource pack kind of like a module. So this is something that you can add to InSpec to give further additions of tests. So let's talk about InSpec-VMware. So this is a resource pack that was originally released through some of the good folks at Chef. And really the target goal behind this is to allow you to integrate InSpec into your vSphere environment. When this was originally created, it was written in Ruby, specifically using RBVMami. However, if you're at all familiar with the SDKs for vSphere, you probably know that that's an open source but not supported SDK. And then after some discussions, they came back and rewrote the entire thing using PowerShell and making use of PowerCLI. So, personally, I'm not a big Ruby fan, so I found it a whole lot easier to create some resources using PowerShell and PowerCLI. Some of the system requirements here, of course, you have to download and install InSpec. It's available pretty much for all types and flavors of operating systems. You can also use PowerShell and PowerShell Core, and of course PowerCLI is available on PowerShell Core as well. So it's pretty much up to you to for that installation and whatever your best path forward is. Here's a brief look at a control. So this is looking against Active Directory for local user authentication. So we have our title. You can assign it an impact. Which in the end the impact doesn't really have any kind of bearing or weight. This is more for us, user education. Then we have a description. So for my stuff that I'll show later, this is where the vulnerability block goes. And we have our command. So this is literally just a PowerCLI command. Notice there's no connect VI server. There's no disconnect VI server. This is just direct. This is as if you're already connected to a vCenter server. And then we have our describe block down here. So come on. Okay. So here's the entire control. Then we can move along to. Okay, I kind of talked through it. There we go. So this is our describe block, and these are our tests. So in this case, we have two tests. One is an exit status, which basically means, okay, did this run successfully against our node? And then the second one is, did it receive anything back? Because that's just how the command was written. So a brief walkthrough, because I'll do this later, but I did want to get this into the slide deck. This is an example of what it would look like. So on the top level here, we're running the InSpec executable. We're telling it to execute our InSpec-VMware-Compliance resource pack. And with the -T, we're specifying that we're using the VMware provider against the ESX04 host using the root credentials and plain text password. That's all for the purposes of our use case today. That's obviously not a best practice. So then within here, we have two different controls, one looking at that local user authentication, whether or not that's possible. And then we're also doing, we're doing that twice because the second one is looking for, when you output when you show the output from get VM host authentication, there's the host name, there's the domain property, and then there's the domain membership status. So in this case, we're checking to see, does it have a domain name in that property? In this case, we're saying that, hey, this standard out should not be empty. And then on the second one, we're checking to see if the domain membership status is okay. Because, even if it's connected to the domain, that doesn't mean that the status is there properly. So, both of these tests failed within our two controls. And then down at the bottom, we kind of have a summary of what happened there. So, the two successful ones were, did this run against our object properly? And then the two, technically 3 failures were all the, are the properties there or not? So here's a brief look at what this looks like. So if we ran this in our PowerCLI or PowerShell session through PowerCLI, along the top, we can see that this is ESX04. We have nothing for the domain and nothing for the domain membership. If we follow the security guide, we can see that, to remediate this, it's set VM host authentication. We can give it a username and password. And then the response just says that our domain membership is now okay. After a reboot, we can now see along the bottom, this is what it should look like if it's, following the security guidelines, which means that, the domain is populated as well as the domain membership is at a status of okay. So then if we went back and reran that test, we can now see that we pass everything. We have our 2 successful controls and 5 successful tests. So one more thing before we jump into demos, I wanted to talk about the reporter, because, what I just showed, that's very useful for you running it through the command line yourself. But that's not something that you're going to want to hand over to your auditing team or to your boss or anything of that nature. So InSpec does have some other options for output, including, anything from the CLI standards to documentation. So this is a brief, high-level overview that's fairly condensed, that just explaining what was happening, as well as outputting a reasonably readable HTML document. So there are some options as far as reporting that are available as well. Okay, so let's get into my little pet project here, InSpec-VMware-Compliance. So this is something that lives out in my GitHub repo, and InSpec-VMware-Compliance, particularly right now because I had to rewrite quite a bit of it going from Ruby over to PowerShell. It's particularly focused on ESXi compliance, and it's covering the first essentially 25 lines through the hardening guide. We're up to 22 different profiles with 61 different tests. So let's get into demos. Here. Sorry, I'm recording this as well on my local system. So let's run our executable here. We're going to run this against our ESX01 host this for the first time. Because I'll show you what the output looks like, and then we can look at what the repository looks like. One of the big things to note with this, and something to consider if you're running this against multiple hosts or larger environments, it pretty much runs all of these tests at once. So we have, was it 22 different controls. So that means that if we looked at our vCenter server, technically the host in this case, we're going to see that there are 22 different sessions that are connected while this test is running. So running it against our first system, here we have 14 different control failures, 8 were successful. We had 16 failures for tests. For line 24 of the configuration guide, that's regarding TPS or transparent page sharing. On line 25, that's in regards to your image profile. So are you at a VMware accepted, partner accepted, community accepted, or I should say supported level? We have some incorrect settings in terms of how long the ESXi shell and SSH service are left available. Let's go to the end here so I can show you what the actual setting is. So it's telling us right here that our value should match 900. But in our case, it received back a 0. So it had no setting. I mean, just like the shell and SSH service are going to continually run when turned on. The other fun part of going through this is that we're also not working with direct, like in this use case, we're not dealing with integers. So we're using their strings. So we have a return and a new line character that we have to match at the end of this. That's still something that I'm trying to work around. Some of the other ones, I already talked about the interactive timeout. We have our password policy. So, is it something that is fairly complex? DCUI or the on system UI. ESXi firewall, that's going to be a fun one to do because according to the security guide, this is a setting or a look and saying, hey, if you have anything that is open, any service or any port that allows traffic, it should have some kind of firewall rule, kind of limiting the IP address or subnets that can access this. So that one could be a little fun to one, properly test against or describe against, as well as to try and actually get and bring into compliance. The other two to be aware of here is lockdown. So there are two different lines in the security configuration guide. One is around normal lockdown mode, and the other one is around strict lockdown mode. I know strict lockdown mode is basically, you've turned your ESXi host into a headless node. There's pretty much no way for you to log into it. Normal lockdown, I believe, is just that you can log in with certain specific accounts, but it's essentially read-only. Adding in some new users. Anyways, let's look at this in GitHub. But it's fairly verbose. Where'd it go? So this is our profile. So this is the InSpec-VMware-Compliance profile that I've created. It is private right now. It'll be public as soon as this session is done. It basically has your generic YAML that's at the front that is a description, very similar to what we have in PowerShell when you're describing your module, setting things as, what it depends on. So in this case, it depends on an external resource pack, the InSpec VMware resource pack. And just some summaries, what licensing it follows, names. Then we have our controls. So these are those tests that I was speaking about earlier. So these are all technically Ruby based. However, if you open them up, they're what I described earlier. So the key part here is just the command block that runs PowerCLI itself, followed up by the two tests there that are part of the describe block. Let me see. There's one of these that was fairly complex, but I wanted to. Here we go. So here's the one that I was showing earlier. There was actually two different sets of controls in a single in the single pack. So this is going ahead and doing our what does the domain property look like, as well as what does the domain membership status look like. So for the first one, unless you want to configure it specifically for your own particular domain, you could add in a test for that. Otherwise, just should not be empty is more than okay. And then for the domain membership, that should match up with okay. Where there was one other one. Set the timeout. Not timeout. Hmm. So the other thing that is worth mentioning here, they sprung a little bit of a surprise on me because the original InSpec this now lives in the chef boneyard. So apparently they have given up maintenance of this. So now I'm going through the process of figuring out, is this something that I can talk them back into bringing inside of Chef, or is this something that I need to take over ownership and maintenance of? So keep that in mind as well. On the other hand, Chef also does allow you, or rather I should say InSpec also has a, instead of the VMware, where's my, go back. Oops, not far enough. So I just realized I didn't cover what's happening here in the describe block. So as part of the describe block, there is there's basically something that tells InSpec what it's doing. So as part of this, it's saying, we're going to run that command. We're going to do it as a PowerCLI command, which means that, when I mentioned earlier that there's no connect VI server or disconnect VI server, that's rolled up into that InSpec VMware resource pack. Now, Chef also offers a couple different languages that you could also perform commands in, and one of them is PowerShell. So if I can't talk them into continuing support of InSpec VMware or allowing me to take it over, I can always, go back and rewrite these for the third time into PowerShell. Let's take a look at one more demo here. We're going to run this against a host that is a little more compliant. So we're just rerunning our InSpec execute against our InSpec VMware-Compliance. So, there we go. So in this case, this is a host that I've already gone through and kind of done some of the security configuration, applied some of those settings to it. So instead of what we had before, we are now up to 18 successful controls, with 4 of those being control failures, and a total of 57 successful tests and only 4 failures. So if we look at our failures here, we have our firewall permissions. I did not go through and configure each one of those services to have a firewall rule set. The other one that you'll want to take a look at is the lockdown mode settings, because as I said before, we have normal and strict. So those are 2 separate tests. So if you're looking to get everything to pass, you want to remove one of those, whichever one you're going to follow, assuming that you're going to follow it. And then the last one, apparently my persistent logging didn't pick up. So that's interesting. So when I say that you could go back through and, sorry? Which one? Yep. Yeah, so when we're dealing with odd return results, because they're strings, but they're kind of not quite strings. I'm still trying to wrap my head around how to deal with that. So I had to go to a not include instead of a should or a what have you. So I was just looking for the your standard /scratch/log. It couldn't really handle the empty brackets very positively. Oops, couldn't handle that very positively through through an equal. And then so for the last demo, it's going to be something pretty straightforward, but say you want to remove some of these, you don't think that they're relevant for what you need to do. I'm just going to remove them, dump them out outside of the controls folder, and then we can just run that again. There we go. So now we just had the 3 controls, and everything was successful because we ran it on that ESX04 host. So with that, the repo will be going public here shortly. Slides will be uploaded to the PSConf EU 2019 GitHub repo. And so with that, I'll leave this up here. Further information about me and how to contact me and where my GitHub repo is. Does anybody have any questions? Yes. Yes. So the question was around, can you run this against a vCenter server? And you can run it against the vCenter server. However, right now, the way that it's configured, if any of those hosts fail, they're all going to fail. So that's something that I'm trying to wrap my head around as well. So it's an all or nothing. It's very binary in that case. So if you have 100 hosts and one fail, one particular host doesn't match up, it's going to say, oh look, the test as a whole failed. Which, depending upon your environment, that might be okay. You might want those separated out. So that's a configuration setting that I'm trying to work through. Yes. Mm-hmm. Totally your call. So there is a project that's out there that's called vSphere with a V that does something that's very similar, although it has added a remediation piece to it. Sorry, the question was around how would I compare this to using something like Pester? So what I was talking about was the project called vSphere, which already has quite a bit of the work done for you already, although it changes things because it is also trying to be used in a configuration management type. So think of this as maybe an inclusion to a project or something that you already have. So if you're already using InSpec in your environment, this would fit very nicely in with that. If you have nothing, then it's kind of your choice. Would you rather use Pester, something that's natively in PowerShell, or do you want to use InSpec that's it's targeted and focused on compliance? Because that's the one thing that I guess I didn't cover. So the one thing about InSpec, it is completely auditing. It is completely compliance. There's no remediation next steps for this. Now, I believe you can tie in Chef Automate and make some of that stuff happen. But that was, anytime you're talking security and hardening guides and things of that nature, personally, I don't necessarily want to be too much involved in the process of remediations, because all of a sudden you said lockdown mode and people can't log into their hosts, and now you've gone from just your standard normal angry issue creations to people trying to call you and doing things like that, and like, oh, I'm locked out of all 100 of my systems. Like, it's a little much. So it also comes down to that as well. The long story short, what are you using in your environment today? This is a perfect plugin if you're using it. Otherwise, totally your call. So the question is around the current status of vSphere. So as far as I know, Chris Wall did archive it. The last I heard that it was being opened up to the community. If any of the other maintainers like Brian Bunke or some of the other folks wanted to continue maintenance of that. So far, I haven't seen anything, anybody who's really up for the task. Personally, from my standpoint, I'm really excited about the DSC stuff that VMware has coming out. I had a session yesterday about it specifically and how far we are so far. But again, that comes down to your choice. If you are much better versed in Pester and creating Pester tests and some of the remediation tactics that they're using in Vester, might be better off following that path. If you're more comfortable or you need something from support is still a little iffy from the VMware side for the PowerCLI and DSC resources. That's something that we're still working through. But if there's something around support that is a requirement for you, I would definitely start taking a look at the DSC side. Yes. Okay. So the comment, to repeat this for the recording, was around Vester being really easy to add additional tests to, as well as being very friendly for brownfield environments. All right, I think that's it. So thank you all for hanging out until Friday and coming to watch.